So I'm going to give you a bit of a large view picture. I'm hoping that it will include some information that you may not have had before. I was encouraged in this by Newton and John here, who had an interest in my historical approach. I am a research scientist. That's my background, soil physics and wetland ecology. I've wound up kind of becoming halfway toward a historian. Wasn't my intent, but if you're going to restore Grandma's dining room set that you found in the attic, you need to know what it looked like to start with. Otherwise, you're not restoring it. You're just repainting it to use when you send the kids off to college, which is fine. But if you want to do restoration, you better have some idea of what it looked like. And as most everyone in the room knows, South Florida in the 1800s was still frontier. In the area that's now got 6 to 7 million people in it, around the turn, when I say turn of the century, I mean 1900, that's the historian part. Turn of the century, 1900, there were about 100, 200 people in all of South Florida. And let me tell you, most of them were not scientists documenting the pre-project condition of the Everglades. So I got put on, through circumstances, onto the idea of trying to get that picture of what this, and we won't say dining room set, but what this ecosystem looked like before we did all the extensive water management that has been done in the Everglades. And to do that, we had to reach out to very non-traditional sources. So let's get started in some of that. All right. And your very basic outline is kind of what you'd think what it was like, some about what it's currently like, and a little bit on restoration. I'm not going to talk very much about restoration. I'm going to do this and punt over to Lawrence, because he's with the Water Management District, and he can answer any questions on restoration. It doesn't matter that he works in the Kissimmee, we'll make him answer anyhow. And I'll try to do my best on some of it. All right, basic thing. And this is something that even for a lot of folks who work in the current Everglades, they read this book that came out in the spring of 2011, and they come out shaking their heads and say, wow, basically what you got there, wet, 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 and then I added on ducks. Obviously, if it's a little wetter and you got some serious water depths, you're more likely to have ducks. I'm not going to tell you too much about what the duck population was like, but I'll show you some slides toward the end that might give you some ideas on that. This is, I can see from here, is distorted a little bit. The Everglades just got fatter than they really are, but that's okay. You can shrink them down. Some of you will probably have seen the diagram on the left. Various versions of it have floated around quite a bit. It's something that we did as part of putting together this book. You'll recognize Lake Okeechobee, Miami, West Palm Beach, usual sorts of things, and the remaining Everglades, and you'll see that these two pictures are pretty different. You can make out some remaining natural area. You can't make out the yellow line that outlines it all that well. But look here at the extent in the original system. A big chunk of what's now people in quite a bit of density was Everglades at one time. Another big chunk, as probably almost everybody knows here at the top, and significantly between Lake Okeechobee and the remaining Everglades, is now sugarcane fields or high-value veg crops or some medium-value sod, and it stands in the way of Lake Okeechobee and the remaining part of it. The high ground, which is what was developed first, was actually very narrow, and this is really, we should import lots of Dutch people, like where my mother's family comes from, because this is really a reclaimed polder, is probably the best description for that. And it took me a while to realize this, but if you drive around this area, you'll see, and you look closely at the vegetation. This is in suburban Broward County, northern Miami County. You'll look at the vegetation, and you look long enough, it has kind of a weird feel to it. And that's because everything that's growing there, with a few exceptions, everything that's growing there wasn't there. It was Everglades before, and wetland vegetation. So I'll give you just a little bit of a flavor of the kinds of sources. There isn't time to get into all of them, but kind of an idea of how do you put together a scientifically useful and useful to modelers picture of a system that hasn't existed undisturbed since before 1880, when Distin got started. Anybody recognize and can tell me the name of that tree? All right, Pete's disqualified, but all right, we'll let him do it anyhow. Okay, anybody else in the room besides Pete, have they seen that tree? You need to, okay, there's one person who asked. You need to make a hike to see it. It does not look like that, doesn't even look like this. The tree does. The tree looks like that, but there's a big overpass right next to it that swings around, makes an angle. But the tree, you got to get off of that and kind of poke around. It's near the library. It's worth the hike, and there's actually a historic marker on it. And the tree is very recognizable as clearly the same tree, even if it wasn't marked. But look at what you're looking at for water levels here. That's a cypress tree. Everybody in this room knows that cypress grows in water, not on the top of a hill. This is what it looked like by 1930. Your water level, it's lucky the roots are still going. Water level is way down from that, probably 6 feet down, and it's probably even a little bit more now. And what the heck, what happened to Lake Okeechobee? It's right there. It's way out. So we dropped the water level, and in this location, you push the edge further in. That's sawgrass. That's not sawgrass. Sawgrass, it turns out, is a very significant thing. Sawgrass is sort of what the Everglades is about in a big way. But sawgrass doesn't grow it's a wetland plant, as you know, and it needs seasonal water on it. And if you know something about where sawgrass is, you know something about the relationship of that part of the earth. The interesting thing, and this is something that came out in the course of the book and surprised a lot of people, surprised me too, is that if you go far enough back and you look along the whole southern shoreline of Lake Okeechobee, everybody knows about the custard apple forest that was along part of that shoreline, and people know that water flowed out of that. And if you look around the early literature, sort of 1920s, they'll say, well, there was this berm along the south shore of Lake Okeechobee, and that's where the custard apple was, and when it got up high enough, it'd overflow the berm and then go into the Everglades. That's part of the story. The other part of the story is a good deal of the rest of the shoreline that wasn't pond apple was sawgrass, right smack up to the lake, just like you're seeing there. Well, that tells you that there's no berm there, because you don't grow sawgrass on a berm, you grow woody vegetation on a berm. And that's exactly what happened as we started lowering the lake. Then you start seeing accounts of woody vegetation invading the sawgrass along the shoreline. But if you push back far enough, you get sawgrass along that whole shore. Well, why do we care about that? It's not just a curiosity. You care about it because if there's sawgrass along 30, 40 miles of that shoreline, that means that that lake water is directly connected to the Everglades much of the year. Now, what does that tell you about the hydrologic connection of the lake to the Everglades? Big deal at that point. That means during most years and during much of the year, there was leakage of water out of the Everglades along a very long shoreline. And the same thing happened in the pond apple forest. It was probably actually a little bit lower there, not a lot, and it had sawgrass pretty quickly behind it. So basically the whole shoreline functioned as a sawgrass, hydrologically as a sawgrass interface. But that tells you in the big picture of things, Lake Okeechobee, the Kissimmee Valley, was very much connected to the Everglades. So that's one piece of putting together that picture. Surveyors, at least up until about 1915, were wonderful. Their instructions said, when you're out there surveying, write down everything you can think of and then write down some more. So they give you widths of any water bodies that they cross. So if you want to know how wide some stream was, if it was surveyed prior to about 1910, 1915, you can find that number up in the Tallahassee records. And they'll write down all sorts of interesting things. That's highland hardwood vegetation in there. You can't read the fine print. Some of these lines, obviously this stuff is creeks. Now those creeks get dendritic up at the top. That's where they met the Everglades. You go back and look at the historical documents and somebody comes along in the 1800s and wants to put a water mill on those creeks, and you look a little bit more and those creeks are running year-round. That tells you something about the elevation of the Everglades relative to the hard shoreline. And then you get things in details. Principal passage to the Everglades. When you go back and look for accounts, when people were coming up from Miami, which was all of Fort Dallas and maybe 5 people, when they went up and wanted to steal the ballots, we've done this for a long time in Florida, when they wanted to steal the ballots and hike them up to the upper part of Dade County, which is now Palm Beach County, you could either go along the ocean, or if the weather was bad, you went up the principal passage, up Snake Creek, through the Everglades, and came back out either at Fort Lauderdale or a little bit further up. Well, that means that there was enough water in the Everglades that you could move a significant sized boat, and that it was open enough that you could do it with a reasonable amount of effort. In the last slide, we saw what that STA, I'll call it an STA, but the treatment cell, the picture that showed fire flag, spike rush, and pickerel weed. Did that look like something you'd have a lot of fun canoeing through? No. And you know from all your own experience being out there that as the water gets deeper, you tend to get more open water. And so if you know how fast somebody canoed, that they made 7 or 10 or 15 miles in a day, they weren't pushing through spike rush. And that gives you an idea of water depths. So that's part of this sort of reconstructing out of the old materials. Interestingly, this is a 1-mile log, the 5th mile west in whatever township it was. There are pages and pages of these. They're a little bit of a chore to read, but you can. You get used to people's handwriting. Interestingly, this is going boom, 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 like that. It's going up and down. He's crossing from sloughs, your open water type stuff. He'll talk about water lilies sometimes. He'll say exit slough, enter sawgrass, exit slough, enter a myrtle ridge, wax myrtle, and back and forth, and doing that repeatedly. And he even gives you the measurements of when he went through those transitions. Now let's say you're out in a wetland, and it's kind of this fuzzy transition from open water to some other vegetation, and it's kind of diffuse. Are you going to measure that edge? Probably not, and probably not as repeatedly as they did in this system. That's one of the indications that suggests, and we'll see that in some of the pictures, that the transitions between what we call in the Everglades sawgrass ridges, which were higher, and sloughs, which were open water and water lilies, and clearly open, that transition was very sharp. And that becomes part of our picture of how this system functioned. It's a little hard to see, but this, for those of you who know the area, this is Tamiami Trail, Big Cypress, Tamiami Trail 40-mile and 50-mile bend, Miami over here. This is Water Conservation Area 3, 3A, the L67 levees, and 3B. Remember 3A and B, that's a big deal in Everglades restoration. And then south of Tamiami Trail down here is Everglades National Park. The significance of this red line that you can't make out too well, that's kind of funny, it's straight lines only, that's surveying, is that we have recorded notes of both vegetation and water depths along that whole transect from 1885. Surveyor Mickler was, he must have been slightly nuts, but he was out there and took notes on the whole thing. His wife's probably not happy because he was out there at Christmas too. And all within the period of about a month, month and a half. And that is very interesting to us because this is state land with a very different water management mandate from the federal land, Everglades National Park, south of it. This 3A is impounded. Tamiami Trail holds water back above it. Everglades National Park has no impoundment. It just flows out to Florida Bay. And their upper end is limited by what we feed them from up above. So having a that system transect that you can look at is very helpful because right now the difference between 3A and Everglades National Park is huge. They look totally different. And the question then is, well, did they always look different? Or is that something that's a function of our management system? And the answer that Mickler would say is almost that whole length of this transect, which is all in a peat-based, what we call ridge and slough landscape, was one of two depths. It was either about 2.5 feet or it was about 1 foot. And we think, that's speculation, you can't nail that down. We think that the difference between the 2.5 feet and the I guess 1.5 feet is that same thing of going over ridges and sloughs. When he's on a ridge, he's in shallower water. When he's in a slough, he's in deeper water. And there's other surveyors' observations that seem to fit with that, and his vegetation observations fit with it. A little bit about that landscape. I won't talk about the Sawgrass Plains portion of it. I'll focus on this because that's most of what we have left at this point. Plenty of water at present. That gets back to that ability to canoe 10, 15 miles in a day. Alternating sawgrass ridges with open leads of water. That alternating is a very key part of this system. Oops. Little digression. Which one of these is Everglades? And Pete can't answer because he's been reading the book besides. I'll take votes for this one. I'm not getting any votes. This one? Good, that's good because that's the Sahara. It's sand pattern. But it is a very directional pattern to it, and it has irregularity. It has that up and down sort of thing. It's wind-based, but it's a pattern system. This one, maybe, maybe not. That's good. At least it's a wetland. I don't know if it has ducks or not, but that's a boreal string bog up in northern. It's peat-based. The light-colored gray is higher grassy vegetation. The darker is what we would call a slough. And in fact, many of them have water lilies in them. And that's the Everglades. Ignore the funny dark spots. Those are not airboats. That's just functions of the old photography. The light gray, same as here, are the higher ridges. The dark are sloughs. And remember that alternating, that's going across this way. If you want to make good time, you go this way. If you're surveying for the railroads, somebody else is telling you which way to go, and you go read the accounts, and they're mostly going this way, and they complain when they're pushing through sawgrass because those ridges were significantly higher than the sloughs, and of course the vegetation on it was not a lot of fun to push through. But they made it. And the interesting thing is the guys that were out there, bless them, wrote down a lot of stuff. A lot of the folks that made expeditions across, whether they were doing it chasing Indians or chasing railroad routes or just surveying, they sat down in the camps at night and wrote notes. And in a few cases, we've even had two folks in the same expedition that wrote notes, so you can check them against each other. So when you're out, write notes and leave them somewhere. Stick them in a library. 1917, that's sawgrass. That's your sharp edge. This is slough in here, and the dark stuff is a little bit higher, tree islands, the woody vegetation. Gives you some idea of what it looked like at that time. You did say that I like to be in sloughs. That's me. This is in an area that's probably a little deeper than what it should be. It's pretty good duck hunting, though. Zooming up a little bit, you start seeing this is all water lilies and slough. These patches are sawgrass. You can't see a lot of pattern other than both exist there. But you get up a bit higher. This is a tree island in the front. But these are all sawgrass ridges, and there's your alternating ridges and slough. Still exists current in some places. Looks pretty good in some places. And the key here is that this pattern is in cross-section. It's all peat-based in this system. And what the significance of that is that peat changes depending on what you do with the water on it. If you lower the water levels, you can take this bumpiness that gives you sawgrass ridges and you can flatten that right out. And the same thing with the peat on a tree island. You can manage that in such a way that you completely lose that elevation and you can't grow trees on it because they need to be up a little higher. And so how you manage the water has a good deal to whether you can preserve this patterning. And it relates, of course, if you're a duck, are you feeding in the sawgrass? Not much. There are little openings in some of it, and you may get some feeding, but mostly you're going to be in sloughs. Same thing if you're a wading bird. So having that pattern system is very important to the Everglades. This is just to say that not all governors are bad. This drawing is Lake Okeechobee up here, Biscayne Bay down there, some tree islands. We'll cut him some slack that he drew them as Lombardy poplars from South France. We don't know why that was. But he's got the little divots in there. Those are sloughs, we figure. and then up a little higher is ridges. He's drawn them short on the sloughs because he's doing it along the long axis. He's got the elevation of Lake Okeechobee, right? This was, I think it was Governor Ryan or Jennings, I forget which, but around 1905. Now, it was a drawing saying, this is what it looks like now, and we want to drain it. But hey, he did get, his drawing is actually pretty accurate. And the significant thing on it, other than that governors sometimes get these things right, is that's sloped. And if you think about it, most of the wetlands that we hang out in, where do you find them? Not on the top of hills, right? Down in hollows. They're usually a low spot where water accumulates and it just sits there. And kind of like we asked about the cell in the last presentation, they tend to level out because the peat accumulates and levels. The weird thing here is this is all peat, but it's on a slope. And what that means is that this was a very dynamic system. The slope wasn't anything to knock your socks off. I'll bet this room could slope as much as the Everglades and you wouldn't be able to tell because it was 3 inches in a mile. It's slight. And you could probably turn somebody around and say, well, yeah, oh, it slopes that way, and he'd be 180 degrees off. But what he could tell you is that he could tell you the thing, and in fact, in the actual system, when they were out there, he would tell you which way it was going because you could see some of the flow. Not always and not everywhere, but there were places where you could see it. It was but it was slow, but it was visible. So, sloped, peat-based system. That's kind of the take-home. This is modeling of a chunk of some of the remaining Everglades. This line is ground surface estimated for pre-drainage, and this is simulated water surface measured in sloughs in that system. And what you'll notice is the blue line never crosses the brown line. It goes down, and it's a little bit like we were talking about in the last one, that if you want to manage for wetland vegetation, you'd rather it didn't dry out. Would it have ever dried out in the Everglades? Yes. Was the return frequency pretty low? 1 in 10 years, 1 in 20 years, maybe a little longer? Very likely. So your sloughs were not drying out very often. And that's very significant to how that system worked. It's also a good way to grow water lilies. If you go into Everglades National Park, you can find things that look like sloughs, but you can almost find no water lilies. It's that dry in that system. And then on average, you can turn that into statistics, but we'll skip that. So your pre-drainage system, we just saw that one. Your water slope, it's a dynamic system. It's parallel to the ground slope. It goes up and down, and it's flowing all the time, but it's basically parallel to the ground slope. Goes up and down. See if I can do this here. It's a pattern system. Having those slough environments adjacent to somewhat semi-terrestrial ridge environments is a function of some feature of that being a flowing system. We don't fully understand exactly how and why, but there's a connection to the flow. And we've got a lot of historical information that backs all this stuff up. So now let's look at the current system. Well, obviously there's not as much of it left. Big chunk of it's gone. It's disconnected from Lake Okeechobee. So in order to keep it a flowing system, we have to mechanically somehow or other provide that connection. Then obviously there's a water quality issue. All of us in this room are aware of that. We don't worry about nitrogen as much, but we certainly worry about phosphorus. I won't talk about that because lots of other people are much more knowledgeable of it. And then the big thing is, in our wisdom, on that slope system, we said, well, geez, you don't want that water just running out to tide, running out to the ocean. That'd waste it. Why don't we hang on to some of that water so we can keep it? Because even in the 40s, people understood that we had a seasonal climate, that half the year we're flooding and we don't know what to do, and then the next thing you know, you're in the drought season and you don't have enough water. So we should conserve some of that water. So we created water conservation areas. And the thought was good. But what happens to water surfaces when you impound things? We'll come back, we'll hold that thought. And we'll look at the compartmentalization both in terms of flows and in depths. Flows, I think you can figure out even before I tell you. This is 3A. This is the L67 levees. They put 2 of them because of the leaky groundwater. And this is 3B. To those flow directions, you may not be able to see them in the back, but they come down this way and then they go boink. Boink is a technical hydrology term. It means to take a right angle when you hit a levee. And they do weird things here, much of which is pointing over to the east. Does Miami drink a lot of water? Yeah, the Miami well fields, some of them are right there. Similarly, in Everglades National Park, you've got flow arrows going off to some of the drained area to the east. So the flow directions get changed around in a weird way. Compartmentalization, we do it a lot in the Everglades. Obviously, we've disconnected Lake Okeechobee because we've got ag land below it. There's the levee or dike on the south, Hoover Dike on the south shore of Lake Okeechobee. There's Alligator Alley. You can see, and that's running crosswise to the flow direction. That one we did a little better about maintaining flow underneath it. This one is the C11 canal, the old South New River Canal. Doesn't actually do much of anything, but look at how different the landscape is on one side and the other. This is a system that's very sensitive to changes in the hydrology. And where are we now? Oh, this is the L67, the westernmost one there. This is 3A, which still has fairly good patterning up in here, except remember that flow direction. This is the pre-drainage flow directions. The current ones do the boink thing, so they're running actually crosswise to some of that landscape. And look at the other side of it, where you're downstream from the levee. Your sloughs are disappearing. You got lots more sawgrass. Which side of this is... This is Tamiami Trail, give you a hint, and ignore this up here. It's a little hard to tell because I've combined them, but this picture ends here. Which side of this is the better protected Everglades National Park? The left side or the right side? This one. I'm hearing a right side. Do I have any votes for the left side? Oh, come on, somebody's got to vote for the left side. It looks better over there. All right, we got some votes for the left side. This is not the better protected, stronger level of protection. This is Water Conservation Area 3A. It is doing better because it's got more water on it. This is downstream and is not doing as well. Here you get a lot of scrubby hardwood vegetation because it dries out near there. Depths. This is the same transect as I showed earlier, where your water surface was going up and down parallel to the ground surface. This is Tamiami Trail. That picture we just saw was right on either side of that. This is Alligator Alley. Here's your ground surface, and watch what the water surface does over time. It does exactly what, if I'd have given you a blank one of these, all of you would have drawn this figure, the same thing. You'd say, well, tell me where the impoundment is. The water's going to be deepest there. If there's some ground slope, it's going to pile up. And it's going to be shallowest further away from that. And it's going to tend to be flat behind the impoundment. If the ground surface slopes, you're going to get a wedge where it's deepest at the bottom, narrowest at the top. And downstream from that, it's probably going to be dry because we're not giving them all that much water, and it's running out freely. And that's exactly what happens. And what you see in the vegetation signature, if you go down the same transect, very much backs up what you see in the hydrology. And how are we doing on time? I assume we're starting to run out. We're good? 15 minutes. Oh, well, geez. Then I will hold a little bit on this one. The green dots, which you might not be able to tell are green dots, those are measured elevations of tree islands. Because one of the very central problems of Everglades restoration is that you've got these three components of what we call the ridge and slough landscape. You've got sloughs, which clearly want to be very aquatic and grow your water lilies and fish and multi-year fish, so the larger ones, piscivorous fish, and maybe some ducks. You've got sawgrass ridges, which should be noticeably higher, have seasonal water on them. And then you would like to have tree islands, which need to be even higher and have some water on them part of the year, but not too much. They're wetland, they're swamp forest species in many of the areas. Some places they're a little bit higher, drier, and they're hardwoods, but mostly swamp forest. But they can't get too wet. Well, now let me give you a problem. What happens when you manage this system over a period of time where you've lowered the average water level? Well, if you don't lower it too much, your sloughs will still have a fair amount of water. If they don't bottom out too often, they'll kind of still keep some wetland species, and you're okay. But you've lowered the average elevation around those tree islands. And remember, they're mostly peat-based. What's happening to the elevation of that island when you lower it over a decade or 2 decades? Okay. It's going to oxidize that peat because it held its elevation by the balance of peat accumulation and peat oxidation. If you lower the level, sooner or later you run out of tree island elevation. And now what happens if McVoy comes along and says, oh my gosh, you got to have enough water in your sloughs, you know, you should really have maybe 3 feet of water in the sloughs. And the folks that are interested in tree islands say, wait a minute, my tree island's only got 6 inches of elevation to it. If you put 3 feet of water in the sloughs, you just put 2.5 feet of water on my tree island. I can't grow any trees on it. That is one of the challenges of Everglades restoration. And we have done that experiment. We didn't intend to do the experiment, but we've done that experiment. Conservation Area 2, if you go out there and you measure a transect across some of those islands, some of them still, you can see the outline of the tree island, you can match that up to old photographs or old information. Sure enough, there's the island. You go out on it and there's a couple of scraggly things growing on it, woody things. You go across it, measure the elevation relative to the sloughs around it, and it's about 6 inches, or it's nothing. Similarly, there are other places where the Sawgrass Ridge elevations have disappeared. And when you level that peat system, you're going to get level vegetation. And you can either lower the water level and go tree island vegetation on the whole thing, or you can raise it up and grow slough vegetation on the whole thing, or you can put it in the middle and grow sawgrass on the whole thing. But you can't have all 3 of those until you get that elevation difference back. And that is a big challenge. What's useful to know is that as you look at these green dots, there's a lot of variation in tree island height. And when I say a lot, it's significant in the range of water fluctuations. So these islands are never getting inundated. That's at the 99% return frequency. Those guys are high and dry, they'll be fine. Some of these islands, well, they're inundated better than 50% of the time. Some species will hang out okay, but they may be taking some hits. The good news is that there are islands that you can hang on to, and hopefully you can start building back some of the elevations of the other ones, but it's a big challenge. In Everglades Park, it's a little bit different, and the reason seems to be, this is something that kind of came out more recently, these islands are a little bit different, and why it's across the border of Time Trail nobody knows, but they tend to have a very high bedrock bump base to them. So they've got almost no peat on them at this point. It's probably oxidized away because they're way high and dry at this point, so there's nothing keeping it wet. But they've still got the elevation because the rock base is there. The problem here, we're losing tree islands there as well, not because we're drowning them out, but because we're starving them out. Because look at where the water level is. They've got to pull water up several feet through that rock to keep the tree island vegetation going. So if they can get their roots down far enough, they may be okay, but we're seeing losses that's probably due to over-drying there. And I think I've pretty much pointed out all of that, so we'll go on. What does it look like from the air? Some of you have probably been lucky enough to fly over it. Satellite imagery, here's Tamiami Trail, Alligator Alley, those L67 separating 3A from 3B, and then Everglades National Park. Look at, whenever you see, and I'm not telling you anything new, whenever you look at part of the landscape and you see a straight line, yeah, that probably wasn't a natural feature. And if you see a sharp difference across that line, that was probably something we did. And obviously you get a real strong color difference between upstream from these 2 barriers to flow and downstream. And we've seen that earlier transect that we saw simulated runs through here. You can see this is a visual image of how much drier it is in Everglades National Park and in 3B. This is a vegetation map. Yellowish or tannish is sawgrass, blue is slough. Here you see pretty decent patterned landscape. You go to the northern edge of 3A where it dries out too much and not much patterning left, a little bit of patterning here, but it's sort of on its way out. And you look in here, clearly this line is an unnatural line. It corresponds to the L67 levee. And in here, downstream from that thing, where there isn't any water flow into here, boom, the sloughs are pretty much 100% disappeared. That's a concern if you want to preserve the original character of that system. That's pretty hard to see, but this is that 3B area. That's all sawgrass. Little teeny slough-like areas left in it, and for contrast, that's what 3A, that looks like it should look, would look like, or does look like. And we'll do just a little tour down one of those transects and just show you from the air what it, or close to the ground what it looks like. So here we're up in that area that's losing its ridge slough texture. The slough is still there, but it's completely filled with spikerush, with emergent vegetation. We come down one further. Now we're in some of the best preserved area, and you get sloughs that look with open water, water lilies. You could be canoeing across that. Looks pretty good. You go down a little further into 3B, and if you bring your blinkers in tight and look in just that slough, they actually look fairly reasonable. If you stand in that, the vegetation's about right, the water depth isn't too bad, but the elevation difference to the sawgrass around has almost disappeared, and the slough is very small. And when you look at it in plan view, you can see it just sort of shrinking down, and eventually, you know, a bunch of them have already disappeared. The ones that are there now, if we don't do something different, they'll go too. And then in Everglades National Park, Northeast Shark Slough, there's almost nothing that looks slough-like down there. It's just too dry. And it matches up with the average water depths. You get, the vegetation follows water depths. I don't think that's any news to anybody here. So this is the part that I'm going to say the least about, but give you at least some idea. Part of it is to think regionally and say, well, the water that we're pushing out to the estuaries, to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie, which generally are not too happy. 5 minutes? Good. Yeah, we're in the home stretch. They're not too happy about those big pushes of water coming out of Lake Okeechobee. And you remember what we talked about with sawgrass and pond apple at the beginning and the relation between the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee. Well, the original direction was there was no flow out to the St. Lucie because that's completely a man-made channel, and there was much, much less flow out to the Caloosahatchee because that was a marsh interface there. The river didn't even go up to the lake prior to digging out the channel. Most of the water went south into the Everglades. So part of the restoration approach is, well, can we reduce these sideways flows and increase the southward? Now, everybody here probably knows that we have some water quality issues to do that. We also have a problem that you've got sugarcane fields in between, and you need to get that water through there somehow or other. But conceptually, that's part of it. Then thinking spatially, I don't know how many of you can see the flow directions of these arrows, but these are drawn from the original landscape directionality, which we think is pretty close to, it's actually the 1940s directionality, but we think it's pretty close to the original. In fact, we think it's very close. But, and these directions do, in general, this is Conservation Area 1, Conservation Area 2, and built up Broward and Dade counties. Well, this portion of the Everglades turned east and went out through those water mills on all those creeks, which was the passage to the Everglades up through the leaks in the high ground. This eastern portion of the Everglades basically drained out to the Atlantic Ocean. It didn't drain out through Everglades National Park and down to Florida Bay. Well, I mentioned that this is Dutch polder land, reclaimed land. So the bottom edge of this arrow kind of hits a problem. We'll see that in a minute. If you look to the western portion of the remaining Everglades and you follow the directionality there, it comes down, hits Tamiami Trail, is almost straight south at Tamiami Trail, and then angles off a little bit to the southwest as it goes through Shark Slough in Everglades National Park. That portion of it, we've still got a pretty good, long, continuous run other than our compartmentalized pieces. But there's nothing that stands in the way that you couldn't, if you wanted and had enough money, you couldn't remove those. We're not very likely to remove all the people living here or to want to. So your restoration goal for this portion is different for these two areas than it is for this portion of it. So Water Conservation Area 1 is probably always going to be managed basically as a pond. It's going to be managed as a locally rainfall-driven system. People would love to get flow through it. There's just not any easy way to do it. we're desperate enough that the latest schemes that were talked about was to say, well, how about, you know, those things you put in your garden with the little pump and it collects the water at the bottom and pumps it back up and runs it in the top? That's been talked about. Collect the water here, pump it back up to the top, and recirculate internally. It's not totally crazy, but if you step back and think about it, it's kind of crazy. And I don't think we're able to get the money together to do it. So this portion is going to be managed as compartments. But this portion of it, 3A, 3B, and Everglades National Park, that's the real focus to restore a flowing system. So that's your footprints there. And you can see that that's a pretty good footprint. This was a 100-mile run originally. You still got about 60, 70 miles of that run. If you could get rid of the things that block it along the way, you could get a long flowing system. So you got a reasonable chance of it doing well. That's just a close-up of the same thing, but it gives you some idea of how central Conservation Area 3B is to that flow path. And a lot of what we're working on right now in the Central Everglades project is trying to figure out how much can we change water depths in here and get some movement through this as sheet flow, as flow across the landscape. One thing that's useful to know is in terms of quantities of water, are we even in the ballpark? Well, that across this line, the top end of the restorable footprint, that's the flows that come out of the regional modeling of the original system. About 2 million acre-feet per year on average. Currently, we're putting a little under 1,500. So it's not like we're putting, you know, 1,000 and we're 50% off. We're in the ballpark up there. As you get further down here to Shark Slough, we're not looking as good. It should be about still that 2,000, 2 million acre-feet. And currently, we're much less than that. And part of that is water that goes out from this system to the east, and part of that is seepage that leaks out to the east. Those are challenges in that area. So seepage is a big chunk of it, and redirecting where water goes. And this, now we're in the home stretch. This is what it looks like generalized currently. Your ridges are much lower than they compared to slough elevation. Your sloughs tend to be much denser with vegetation because they're shallower in many places. Not everywhere, but in many places. And so what grows in it and what species you can support is different. And a lot of the things that you do that are more open water associated are forced into canals because that's your deeper water. In the original system, your Sawgrass Ridge elevation in peat, these are cross-sections of course, was much higher compared to the sloughs. There weren't any canals, so we didn't draw those in. And your water levels ranged up and down in this range. So part of the year the Sawgrass peat is getting a little bit of exposure, still wet, but it's getting some exposure. And that has chemistry significance. It has biological significance in terms of refugia, things going in and out of the sloughs and the Sawgrass Ridges. And you can support big fish that live over multiple years because it doesn't dry out here, and maybe even some ducks. And that's it. This is what we'd like the Everglades to look like down the pike. Open water systems, ridges, and tree islands surviving together in a flowing system. And with that, I'll take questions if there's time.